Just to let you know, the reason that Jen and I are doing this lecture together is we work together in the compassion-focused therapy program here at St. Pat's. And we're both very excited about compassion and compassion-focused therapy, so we both really wanted to be here tonight. So that's why you kind of get two for the price of one tonight. I guess we'd like to start just by asking you to think about the word compassion and what comes to mind when you think about that word. So just take a minute and let whatever associations come and try not to judge them. And then just notice, does that change when you think about the words self-compassion? We know from our work with people here that very often they do have different associations to the words self-compassion. And those associations might be things like it's weak, self-indulgent, selfish, it's about pity, maybe it's kind of soft and fluffy, and maybe it's letting myself off the hook. And I guess we're going to ask you tonight to consider maybe a different definition of compassion than the one that you usually think of. It's the one we use here, and it can be very helpful for engaging with mental health problems like depression. So we'd just like to invite you to consider that compassion is the recognition of and engagement with suffering, together with a commitment to alleviate it or prevent it. And we need both parts of this definition.
So I just wanted to talk you through a little bit of the model that we would use at the start of group, just introducing these ideas about compassion to people who come to the group. So we start by talking a little bit about the brain and trying to help people understand emotions and the kind of emotions that we all have as part of being human. And what we talk about is how our brains, in compassion we describe them as being tricky brains, that there's an old part to the brain and a new part. So when we think about the old brain is the piece of our brain that we share with animals. So if you think about like a pet at home or an animal that you know, the piece about having emotions, having desires, like when we feel frightened, we want to run away or we want to attack. So all of those really basic biological drives. So thinking about desires as well, that, you know, that we want to sleep, that we want to eat. Just that we have this old brain, and that's the part of our brain, it's the amygdala, it's down at the back of the brain, and that's the part where the emotions come from, okay? But along with that, the part that's unique to us because we're human is that we have a new brain. So because our brain has evolved more than an animal's brain, we're able to do things like think and plan. So we can think about the future, we can think about the past, we can make plans for things we want to do. We have like a sense of ourself, like who am I, what kind of person am I? And we have imagination. We can think about things that don't exist. And these are all things that are really kind of wonderful qualities that humans have, but that animals don't have. I guess the key part to this is the link between the two. So we have this one part of our brain that's responsible for our emotions and all those basic drives, and that is there to help us survive. And we have this other part of our brain that's about helping us kind of make sense of the world and plan for the future and think about our past. And what often happens is that the interaction between these two brains, it doesn't go smoothly. So we can kind of get caught in loops. And that's what we'll talk about a lot in compassion-focused therapy, how the emotions in the old brain, when the new brain tries to make sense of them, it's like the emotions keep refiring, like it's replaying, okay? So that might make more sense in a minute when we go through an example. So if we think about just an example of an animal, okay, so this is a story that's often told on training courses for compassion-focused therapy. If you think about a zebra that's out grazing, and it's just there with all the other herd of zebras, and it's just all it's focused on is feeding. And then suddenly a lion appears. Okay, so the zebra's old brain gets activated and it thinks danger and it thinks flee. And it starts to run away. Okay? And if somehow, miraculously, the zebra can outrun the lion and it's safe, what happens next for the zebra? Well, what happens next for the zebra is it just goes back to eating. So it's focused on eating until there's a threat to its survival, it gets away from it, and then it goes back to eating. Okay? Because the zebra just has that old brain that's focused on emotions and survival. Whereas if the zebra had a new brain, so if the zebra had the same brain as a human, it'd be a very different story for the zebra. So it'd look a bit more like this. Okay? So rather than just going back to eating, the zebra might think, what if the lion comes back? What if there's 2 lions? What if it chases me? And in some ways, this is just a humorous example, but it's to illustrate a point that people with depression in our groups talk to us about a lot, getting caught in replaying things. So something happens and it makes them feel really anxious or angry or sad, and hours and days and weeks and months later, they find that they're still feeling that it's still going around and around for them. And that one thing we talk about a good bit in the group is just understanding that we have this old brain and new brain, and this is really normal, and this is what happens for everybody, these patterns of rumination and replaying things, but it can be really painful, so it's really important we understand that. Okay? So I'm going to hand you back over to Katie.
So again, just to illustrate a bit more about the difference in us and other animals. So animals don't have to worry about their self-image. They don't worry about their natural responses to things. So part of the insight that we'd like to offer you tonight is that our brains, through not our own choosing, are quite tricky. And we didn't get to choose that. So at the best of times, they're going to be a bit tricky to manage. And when things aren't great, they can get very tricky to manage. Okay, and that's just a design flaw. That's just the old brain, new brain problem. But we also have a mindful brain. And that's the part of our brain that, again, is different about us as humans. We can step back and we can look at what's happening. We can notice those loops. We can catch ourselves ruminating. And that allows us to begin to maybe think about, or to actually begin to start using some self-compassion. Using that insight that we have really tricky brains that we didn't choose. Another insight that we'll offer you, that's again from compassion-focused therapy, but it is really just, I think, very helpful for everyone to think about, is kind of we've all got emotions and they come from different places. And in CFT, we use this 3 circles model to understand our emotions and to think about them and to think about the motives that go along with them. And so we're going to take a look at these 3 circles, red, blue, and green, or threat, drive, and soothing, in a little bit of detail.
So we'll start by looking at the threat circle, and often this is the one that people are most familiar with, and this is the one that causes people a lot of difficulty. So what we mean by our threat system, that's the system that includes emotions like anger or fear or disgust. So things that tend to be very strong biological responses within our body. And the purpose of the threat system is to keep us safe. It's like our body's natural alarm system. So if something's going on in our environment that we need to attend to, our threat system gets activated. And that's the purpose of these emotions, is to bring our attention to what's happening. And the way that our threat system protects us is it has these automatic responses. Most people are familiar with fight or flight. That's usually something people have heard of. But the other 2 that are very automatic and maybe not as familiar to people are freeze and appease. So that when we're under threat, sometimes we just shut down and we can't do anything. That's freeze. Or appease is sometimes we do something to try and kind of reduce the threat, something to appease the person who may be threatening towards us. And it's just part of our biology, this threat system, and we all have it. And I guess the really key bit about it is that it works on a better safe than sorry principle. So that means if we detect any form of threat, our threat system gets activated. We need this system to work really quickly. We can't afford to have it miss anything. This is what helps us survive. Okay? But often what that can mean for people is if you're in a period of prolonged stress or if there's a lot of difficulties happening, it can feel like your threat system is getting activated a lot and like you're having a lot of those emotions. And I guess the other thing that can keep it going is those loops that we spoke about. So when we get caught in replaying things, it's activating our threat system. So just to look at that in a little more detail. So when we're in threat, one thing that changes a lot is the way that we think about things. So our threat system will talk about how there's a really narrow focus for our attention. So if I'm feeling really anxious, then all I'm paying attention to is the thing that I'm feeling frightened of. And people will describe like just focusing in on that and not being able to see the other things that are going on at that moment. Or otherwise kind of like quickly scanning and not really being able to take things in. When we're in threat, we make really rapid decisions and we don't have much information. So people will say things like, I should have known better, or I should have made a better decision. But when we're in threat, we're not able to do that. Okay? It's a very quick response system. It tends to be very extreme, so we don't see the nuances in the environment. We're very quick to disqualify any positives because we're just focused on staying safe. That's scanning and vigilance, and it's very automatic. And that bit is really key, and we talk about that a lot in our groups, that really when you're in threat, you're acting before you have time to think, and your body is designed to do that to keep you safe. And sometimes that's really helpful for thinking about things that we might have done that we wish we hadn't, or things that we didn't do that we wish we had. Another key thing about the threat system is the type of things that trigger it. So the triggers for our threat system can be things external to us. So it can be like a loud noise, or it can be, something kind of aggressive, or something that will be quite startling. But equally, the triggers can be internal. So if we remember something, if we're replaying something, if we're caught in a loop with something, if we're feeling an emotion that we're finding frightening, all of those things can trigger our threat system. And the piece about our threat system is it evolved. It's been there for a very long time for us as humans, and it evolved in an environment where there were a lot of physical threats and dangers, but now our threats tend to be much more social things. So maybe somebody giving us critical feedback, or somebody kind of dismissing us, or feeling like somebody ignores us or lets us down. So things that are social threats, they're not threats to our survival, but our body still responds as if it was a threat to our survival. So just to try and think about that a little bit more, just to think about an example, okay? So just understanding how the threat system works. If you were to imagine that you had an argument with somebody that you cared about, okay? And we all do this sometimes. And the thing about our threat system is it's not just one response, okay? So there's lots of different emotions in there. So if you imagine an argument and think about, there is a part of you when you're in threat that will feel anger. And just maybe for a minute think about, when I have an argument with someone and I feel angry, what do I think? What do I feel? What do I want to do? Okay? And often there are things about, who's right and who's wrong and how we're going to solve it, okay? And if you think about the part of you that might feel anxious or frightened by the argument, and how you would think, and how you would feel, and what you would want to do. And it's often quite different from the part of you that's feeling angry. So the part of us that's feeling anxious might be really worried about the relationship, or what's going to happen, or are we going to be able to sort it out? Yeah? And then if you think about the part of you that might feel sad, and how that part would think and feel, and what you'd want to do. And that just gives us a very small insight into why our threat system is so complex. Because actually there's lots of different parts in it, and generally they are all motivating us to want to do different things. So it's very easy to start to feel like I'm confused or I'm overwhelmed. So the threat response can be very complex. So we would work a lot with people in just understanding that and trying to think about how that is for other people and how we can learn, I guess, a bit more about what it's like for me and how I'd respond to that. Okay?
So one of the important things about this 3 circles model is that it proposes that we need balance in order to be well. So already we've got a challenge that we haven't chosen, because one of our circles has this better safe than sorry principle it operates on. We don't have a choice about that. It needs to function that way to help us survive. So it can already be kind of hard to tone down red and build up our blue and green. But they're really important too. So the blue is our drive system, and that's all about kind of getting things, getting resources that make our lives better, achieving, going after things. So the emotions that we feel when we're in blue are kind of enthusiasm. We feel energized and excited, and we might feel proud when we reach our goal. And that's where our focus is. Our attention is really on meeting that goal, getting the resources that we need, competing with other people sometimes, because sometimes we have to do that. And I guess one of the challenges for people who suffer from depression, and you're probably thinking this as I say this, is that it becomes very hard to access this drive system. It kind of goes offline a bit. And maybe things that you were always able to do without even thinking about it become very difficult. And again, that's not of your choice. And then our other really important system, and it's one we're going to really focus on tonight, is our soothing system. This system actually evolved to help us deal with threat. Because threat has that better safe than sorry way of acting, we need a system that helps us tone it down. This is a system that we share with all mammals. They have this system too. And it involves affiliation with other people, feeling soothed by other people, and learning to be able to soothe ourselves. The emotions that we feel when we're in the green system are calm and content. Maybe we feel at peace or at ease. And it's very different from blue because we don't need anything. We're just really content with where we are. I see some people nodding, and that's great to see. So again, our focus goes on to what can we do to connect with people, or how can we connect with ourselves. And again, this system evolved to help us regulate the other two. But I guess, I sometimes think in Western cultures, I'm not from Ireland, I'm from a different Western country, but we put a lot of emphasis on drive. And our lives are pretty full of threat. But once we get past a certain age, we kind of don't put very much emphasis on soothing. We're quick to soothe children and maybe our closest friends, but often we expect people to just get on with it and not need this. And I suppose one of the insights from compassion is that's not healthy. That doesn't help us stay in balance. So we talk about the three circles as though they're distinct, and they can be, but very often we get into blends, and Jen's going to help us understand that a little better.
Okay, so just a few examples to help this make sense. So that piece of, we have the red, which is our threat, the blue, our drive, moving towards our goals, and the green, our kind of soothing and feeling connected. But if you were to think about just a few situations, they're maybe not the most day-to-day situations, but just... So what blend of emotions do you think there might be if you were skydiving? Which systems do you think you'd be in? Fear, so there'd be some threat. There'd be some threat. Would there be any other of those systems? Enthusiasm and excitement. There might be some drive, okay? So something like an extreme sport is a really good example of when we're in threat and drive. So we're feeling like there's a bit of danger, but also there's a lot of thrill and excitement. Okay, so it's an example of how we can be in two at the same time. What about if you were taking your driving test? What systems would we be in there? Anyone remember doing that? Stress. Yeah, there'd be a lot of stress and threat. And what would we be motivated to do? To pass. We'd want to do well, so we'd have a goal. So there might be a bit of us that's in drive and trying really hard and really working towards a goal and trying to remember everything we've learned. Okay? And what about if you were Katie and I this evening and you were giving a presentation and somebody handed you a microphone and said you're being videoed? What system would that put you in? Threat. Yeah, threat. Okay. And what about this one? What if you meet a new family member? If there's a new baby or a friend has a new baby, and the first time you hold them or pick them up, what system are you in? Soothing. Yeah? And could there be any other system there? Yeah, sort of joy. There might be some drive, some excitement. There might be some fear too. Yeah? Yeah, don't drop it. Okay? So just like everyday situations are often a blend of the three, and it's thinking about, well, which one am I in, but maybe which one's strongest at the moment. So if it's okay, we wanted to ask you all to just take a moment to do a really brief exercise that we would do with almost everybody that comes to our groups, okay? So, I mean, if you have a pen and paper, you're welcome to write it down. If you'd prefer to just think about it in your, in your mind, that's fine too. Well, what we'd like you to do is just think about over the last week. So sort of from the middle of last week up until today. And just think about those three systems. So the threat system that's there to keep us safe, to protect us. Drive that's there to move us towards our goals. And soothing that's there to help us connect with people. And if you were to just draw or think about 3 circles and what sizes they would be, and try and think about them relative to how much time did I spend in each this week. Just give you a second to think about that. Okay, so this is often something we ask people to do at the start of groups, and then maybe when they've learned a bit about compassion-focused therapy, to try and do it again, just to see how things might change, okay? And generally when we ask people to do this in group, they tend to draw something that looks a bit like this. Okay? Lots of nods there, okay? So generally what happens is that threat looks really big, and people feel like I'm spending almost all of my time there. And drive has got pretty small, and soothing has got pretty small. And sometimes they're similar size, and sometimes one of them, people draw it more like a little dot than a circle, because it feels like it's not really there at all. And the other thing people talk to us about is that sometimes threat gets so strong that it's not even like I feel anger or fear or disgust anymore. It's more, and particularly if people have been depressed for a while, it's more that I just feel disconnected. Like I don't really feel anything anymore. Like I just feel kind of numb or shut down. And in compassion-focused therapy, we would think of those as being when threat has been really high for a long time. They're the kinds of feelings people start to have, okay? And if we were to just think about this model in depression, okay? So Paul Gilbert, the psychologist in the UK who developed compassion-focused therapy, has developed a version of what these 3 circles look like in depression. So he would say when we're in threat, people can feel really trapped. There's a sense of dread, a lot of feelings of like anger or irritability or frustration, and feelings of anxiety, and they tend to be the strongest ones. For the drive system, he describes that people just can't look forward. It's like it's hard to make goals and plan. There's a feeling of kind of numbness, that there's no sort of energy or enthusiasm for maybe goals or tasks anymore, and a sense of despair. And that the soothing system can become a sense of maybe feeling separate from others rather than connected, feeling alone, disconnected, and a sense that nobody understands and it's not safe. Because our soothing system is that part that helps us to feel safe and connected to others. And in depression, it can become hard to access that. Okay, so these are the changes that we tend to see.
So a funny thing can happen when we start to think about compassion turned towards ourselves. We get very familiar with something that we call the inner critic. So it's kind of ironic that we're trying to engage in a maybe more gentle way with ourselves, and we meet kind of head up against this very critical voice. Not a real voice usually, it's kind of our thoughts, but very present and very harsh and very cruel a lot. And when we start to feel low, the critic can get even louder and really kick us when we're down. And we might all have different things that our inner critic gets onto us about, is at us about. But very often they're thoughts like, you're worthless, you're lazy, cop onto yourself, you never do anything right, everyone else can cope, what's wrong with you? So really painful, difficult thoughts to have. And this critic that we have inside our own heads, it's kind of like a predisposing and a maintaining factor. So it makes us vulnerable to low mood. And then once it's there, it kind of keeps that going. And when we feel low, when we're feeling really bad, it's really hard to do anything other than just accept what this inner critic is saying. It's almost like we just buy into it, we believe it. And we might even know that a lot of the times it's not logical, it doesn't make sense. We can see evidence that it's not telling the whole story, but it's really hard to challenge it. So those therapies that encourage us to argue with the critic or disprove it or find evidence that goes against and get rid of these thoughts or stop them can be really hard to access. Okay, so the effort might be to just kind of make this stuff go away. But I think what people often find is that they learn that and they know that. And they can kind of do that with those thoughts, but they don't feel any different. So after kind of getting themselves into drive enough to do all that work, they don't really feel any better. And I guess what compassion offers us is something different. Maybe in addition to those other ways of working, but a different way to respond to that critic so that we can balance. Again, balance is really big in the kind of work that we're thinking about tonight. So we might try and think of something like, you're a worthwhile person. You're just suffering right now. It's really hard. Having depression affects my energy levels. It's not just me. I'm not lazy. Depression affects my energy levels. I need to take a minute to breathe. I need to slow things down so I can notice what's happening. What circle am I in? It's a very different way of thinking than cop onto yourself, isn't it? And to remind ourselves of things like, you've accomplished a lot in the past, and you will again. And when we're starting to do this work, trying to develop these new pathways of thinking, it's not important just what we say, but how we say it to ourselves. So if you take a minute and think about the way your critic talks to you, it's probably kind of harsh or angry. It might sound a bit contemptuous. And I guess what we'd encourage you to do, if you want to start working in this way, is that you'd be really careful with your compassionate, balancing thoughts, that they sound friendly, a little more gentle, or even unbiased in some way. But friendly would be better if you can manage that. And finally, I think a really good thought to have can be that everyone struggles to cope at times. I'm struggling right now. If I were being compassionate with myself, what might I do? It's a really different way to think, isn't it? So that's the thing about this green system, is that it calms threat. It can help us manage those really high levels of threat and despair. And we can try and find some balance.
Okay, so we just wanted to share with you, I guess, some of the kind of wisdom or suggestions that CFT would make. If you just go back for a moment to this slide. So our goal when we're learning compassion-focused therapy, it's not to be in green all the time. Sometimes people think that's what it is, that the green system sounds like where they want to be and we should try and be there as much as possible. But our goal is actually to try and have balance in our week. So if you think about those 3 circles that you drew and you think about, well, what would need to happen for them to be balanced? Which ones would I need to see more of? Okay? And we're going to think about a few ideas for what might help us to have more time in that soothing system that we think is really important. So some of it might be reminding ourselves of the wisdom from compassion. So things like, we all experience difficult feelings. So all of those emotions, fear, anger, disgust, sadness, they're part of our threat system, they're part of being human, and everyone feels them. That we can learn new ways to work with feelings, because often it's our response to feelings, what we do when they come up, that causes the difficulties to maintain, that gets us stuck in those loops where we're replaying things. So having a different way to respond to them can be really helpful. And this idea that balancing the 3 circles is our aim if we want to kind of promote our emotional well-being. One of the ideas they talk about is how our minds are like gardens, okay? This can seem a little strange, but I'll just talk you through it. So if you think about that threat system in our brain, okay? So we know that that is there to keep us safe and help us survive. And we're going to get immediately drawn into threat if there's any danger or any risk, okay? So if you were to imagine that you were out doing your Christmas shopping, okay? And it's Christmas Eve and it's really busy and you've a couple of presents left to get, but so does everybody else, okay? And you go into maybe 5 or 6 different shops. And in most of the shops, the shop assistants are really helpful and they get what you want and you don't have to wait too long and you get what you need and you move on. And in one shop, when you go in, the shop assistant kind of ignores you and she's talking to her friend beside her, and when you try to get her attention, she just kind of walks off. Okay, so you're feeling like I've loads to do and I'm really busy and this person's not helping me. Okay? So in maybe 5 of the shops, they're really friendly and helpful, and in this one shop, the person is really rude. And when you go home that evening, which shop assistant do you talk about? Yeah. So there's 5 that are really friendly and helpful, but our brains are designed to notice danger. Okay? So that means we get drawn to threat. Okay? So we have that bias to be drawn to what's negative because we need to have that to survive. Okay? So if we think about our minds being like a garden, if we have a garden and we just leave it wild, what happens is that lots of weeds grow and things get really overgrown and the plants don't survive, okay? But if we want it to look like maybe one of those gardens in the picture, we have to spend time, we have to practice, maybe have to spend time on a really regular basis. We have to pay attention and take care of the things that we want to flourish and survive. And if we don't do that, the weeds just come back, okay? So our brains are going to get pulled to the critic and the threat. And to balance those circles, we need to be kind of prioritizing the things that give us a sense of soothing and connection and kind of planning to make those things happen. So one of the psychologists in the States, Professor Russell Coates, has worked a lot with compassion-focused therapy. And this is a quote from one of his books that I thought kind of captured that idea. That a key issue is to stop blaming ourselves for the way we feel and the way we react. So our threat system is part of our biology. We don't control those emotions. But when that critic comes in, we start to blame ourselves for them. And rather than blaming ourselves, if we can find a way to take responsibility for what we're paying attention to take responsibility and to remember that we have that capacity for enjoyment and happiness and a sense of caring and a sense of peace. And they're all part of our brain's design too, but they have to get prioritised. We will get naturally pulled to threat to help us survive.
So if we think about how we might practice compassion for depression specifically, if we start with that threat system, one thing that might be a really good place to start would be just mindful awareness of those triggers. Remember, Jen was telling us the triggers are different for all of us. But if we can be aware of them and even start to maybe realize them in the moment when we've been triggered into threat, that can be helpful. We can also be mindful of the sensations in our bodies. And instead of as Russell Coles tells us, criticizing ourselves for them or pretending they're not happening. Actually recognizing them and remembering that that's just part of being human. We can catch ourselves when we're ruminating and we're getting stuck in those loops. It can be hard to do, and sometimes it's really hard to extricate ourselves even when we do catch it. They're awful and they're a form of torture, but they're a form of torture that we know, but really not helpful for us. And also we can catch ourselves in that self-critical thinking. And I guess if we're really taking on board the 3 circles and the messages of compassion, we're not going to go straight into drive when we realize we've been triggered and we're in threat. We're going to try to go to soothing. We're going to try and inch our way towards that green circle, as hard as that might sound. And we might start just by trying to change our physiology, slowing down our breathing, finding a rhythm of breathing that's helpful for us, that actually changes our brain from threat-focused to soothing. We might try some mindfulness if we found that that's helpful, or a compassion practice. We can validate our feelings, which is a way of connecting with ourselves in a soothing way. Sometimes we can even notice things that we're grateful for, or we appreciate, or even those moments in the day when things don't seem so bad. In fact, they seem okay. And we can spend time with supportive others. And then getting back into our blue system, bringing that back online can be really important too. So we can think about what goals are important to us, what specific behaviors might be helpful. We can practice mindfully giving and doing things. Often when we're recovering from depression, we have to really be quite brave and assertive, even when that's the last thing we want to do. And I guess our definition of compassion reminds us that we're probably going to have to engage with things that we've been avoiding, that we fear or that we really don't want to go near, if we want to move past them. So now we've got just some everyday ideas for you that other people, different people, some service users here and some psychologists and therapists have said about balancing the 3 circles, things that are helpful. We just wanted to kind of show you those, but what's really important is that you begin to find what works for you, because we're all different. A walk on the beach is great for me, but I know people who find the beach really sticky and messy and they don't like to be there. Some people like the cinema, but other people would prefer to read. Some people really want to reach out to others, and other people find their own company the most soothing sometimes. Music and sport, a massage, and art are all ways that we can move to green. We can try a practice, or we can just be mindful of a daily activity like brushing our teeth or doing the washing up. We can take some time to just notice everyday things that we appreciate and enjoy. And you might be thinking, but how's that going to help? Like, depression is such a huge problem. How is that going to help? And when we're trying to get that balance between the 3 circles, we really have to start with just moments in green. Like Jen said, we're not trying to get there and stay there. We're just trying to increase those moments that we have, a bit of ease, a bit of peace. Our senses are really great ways that we can soothe. So warmth, nice tastes and smells, things that comfort us, like hot baths or showers, or nice candles. One of our best senses to engage if we really want to work with compassion is our sense of smell. because it has a really direct pathway to our brain, really direct way to tone down threat. So we'd like to invite you just to take a minute and think, what would move me towards green? You might want to jot down some things if they're coming to mind, so you don't kind of walk out of here today and forget. And we just wanted to finish the lecture with a quote from another psychologist in the States, Christopher Germer, who reminds us that a moment of compassion can change your entire day, but a string of such moments can change your life.